Hi all, this is Jane Harrison with North Carolina Sea Grant. I see that many of you are on now. We're really excited to have a great turnout for this session. This is all about wastewater treatment on North Carolina's changing coastline. And, you know, I guess since in the last month, we know how important toilet paper is to folks. So I guess septic may have a special place in your heart as well. um, this session, again, was part of North Carolina Water Resources Research Institute, their annual conference that would have been held at the end of March. Fortunately, we're able to do this virtually. So this session is a little bit of an experiment. If you have questions along the way or any comments, please do use the chat function. Um, so I'm going to just kind of get us started. Again, I work for North Carolina Sea Grant, Jane Harrison here. And wastewater infrastructure, is really designed to provide safe and efficient conveyance and treatment of sewage to protect human health and the environment. Increasingly, though, climate change threatens the effectiveness of this infrastructure, particularly in coastal communities. High tide flooding and extreme precipitation events, as well as sea level rise, result in immediate and long-term losses of system functionality. These systems are at risk of impaired ability to process contaminants, which may lead to human illness, ecosystem damage, and ultimately the unlivability of communities that depend on them. Now, this session is being recorded. Again, you should be on mute, I hope. And do use the chat function if you want to connect during the session. Anna Martin with the North Carolina Water Resources Research Institute is co-hosting with me. Anna, if there are any comments or questions that I miss as we're going along, please do bring those up, especially if there are technical difficulties that we need to deal with. I also want to thank again YSI. This is a Xylem brand for generously sponsoring this opportunity to share annual conference content with the public. So without further ado, I am going to change screens here. Let me see for our first speaker, if I can do that. Okay, share this. Okay. Now our first speaker is Michael O'Driscoll with East Carolina University. The title of his talk, Does More Groundwater Mean Less Treatment? The Influence of Sea Level Rise and Coastal Storms on Septic Systems. We have three other speakers that will come up after Mike. Eric Edwards of North Carolina State University. He's going to be talking about the economics of improving coastal wastewater treatment under a changing climate. Lindsay Dubbs with the UNC Coastal Studies Institute. She is going to be talking about people, water, and septic, a coastal case study in Nags Head, North Carolina. And then Lawrence Cahoon of UNC Wilmington is going to talk about how climate change is challenging our wastewater treatment infrastructure, and specifically more of our centralized kind of infrastructure. So I'm just gonna check the chat real quick, make sure everything is working. Yep, okay. And I am gonna start Mike's presentation. You'll note that his presentation has actually been recorded because we just wanted to make sure with some spotty internet issues, we didn't have any trouble with this one. Depending on where you are, Zoom sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. But he is with us live to answer questions after his presentation.
Hi everybody. Today I'd like to try to virtually talk a little bit about some of the research we have been conducting to evaluate how changing groundwater levels near our coast can influence our on-site wastewater treatment infrastructure. There's been a lot of recent work that's shown that groundwater levels in our coastal aquifer system the country have been declining related to groundwater depletion, overpumping of groundwater related to the recharge rates. And Lenny Conoco at USGS has done a real amazing group of studies focused on this. For example, we showed since 1900, we've lost about 264 trillion gallons in our groundwater reserves. So it's common to hear about in North Carolina and throughout the U.S. of groundwater level declines. And there have been management efforts to Central Coastal Plain Capacity Use Area here in North Carolina to reduce some of those impacts. But we do see examples of rebounding groundwater levels associated with that management, and still some examples of declining hydraulic head and groundwater levels in some of our aquifer systems. So one thing right now I think a lot of us would be interested in is going to the beach. Hopefully that will happen soon. But life is different at the beach, right? And one of the things when we look at groundwater level trends is there's also some differences in the patterns that are occurring as we get closer to the coast. And so some of the common trends in groundwater level declines across the country and in parts of North Carolina, they're not observed in the superficial aquifer near our coast. There have been a lot of recent studies in Rhode Island, the Mid-Atlantic, Florida, that have shown that groundwater levels in our coastal superficial aquifer systems have been rising associated with sea level rise. And so this can be a problem for on-site wastewater treatment systems, where with that groundwater level rise, they'll lose some of the unsaturated soils beneath the system. And this is projected to be increasing in certain areas in the future. And this example here from USGS shows those projections moving forward. When we compare North Carolina to the rest of the states along the Atlantic coast, and including Virginia too, we're considered to be in a hotspot area for relative sea level rise. And this study, recent study by Pycook et al., you see I've circled here, the area where sea level rise, relative sea level rise is increasing most rapidly along the Atlantic coastline. So we're a hotspot. We're fortunate to have several tidal gauges in North Carolina where long-term records occur. And one in the area of study is at Duck, North Carolina. They estimate about 4.6 millimeters per year of sea level rise there. Sea level rise and rising groundwater levels along our coast have the potential to have a large influence on our wastewater treatment infrastructure. We're heavily reliant in North Carolina on on-site wastewater treatment systems. And some of this information here is just showing that we do have a higher percentage of on-site systems compared to most states in the US. And a lot of our systems are draining to the coast. It's estimated about 1 million systems are draining to the coast. And about 166,000 of our septic systems are located in our coastal counties. Generally, there are far more on-site systems when you compare these to the municipal systems. And things have been changing a little bit over time, where prior to the 1970s, most of the coastal communities were reliant on septic systems. And more recently, since the 70s, package plants and advanced systems are starting to become a lot more prevalent. So the project that I'll focus on today is working with Jane Harrison, leading this up through NCC grant, funded through NOAA, looking at wastewater infrastructure tipping points. And so we have a large group, and our community partners are Nags Head and Folly Beach, South Carolina. Our goal is to look at a range of wastewater technologies for on-site systems that can be effective under various climate conditions in order to help communities, coastal communities, be able to develop and implement climate adaptation plans for their wastewater infrastructure. So, North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality has 8 superficial aquifer groundwater monitoring wells in Dare County, and these were installed between 1983 and 1994. They generally have had monthly data collection since the early 80s, and then since about 2003 would be the earliest sites they've started to have daily data collections. Good record to look at changes over time. So first thing I like to share is just looking at the 5-year moving average groundwater depth for these sites. And so one thing you can see when you look at these general records is there's a general increase in the groundwater levels and a decline in the groundwater depth that's been occurring over time at these systems for most of the systems. And so when we look at all of the data together, there's a general decline when we compare it to the sea level rise record at Duck, North Carolina, at the NOAA gauge. And so generally what's happening in Dare County is as sea level is rising, the groundwater table is rising. So this can have an influence on the effectiveness of our septic system. This slide here is just showing the change in average groundwater depth across all of the systems compared to the sea level rise data at the Duck gauge. And it shows a declining groundwater depth and rising water table with sea level rise. When we look at all of the groundwater data at these different wells, seasonally, what shows up is there's some strong seasonal patterns in the data, and the median groundwater depths tend to be the greatest in June. So the water table is the deepest in June, median of about 3.2 feet, and then shallowest in February, where the median groundwater depth is 1.57. So there's about a 1.6 foot difference seasonally when you look at all the systems together. So it suggests that the water table rise, which occurs related to the changes in evapotranspiration and precipitation inputs. Typically in the winter months, you're going to have the highest water table. And so this would suggest that during these months, because there's less unsaturated soils beneath the septic systems, they will be less effective treating the waste. This example here shows how the groundwater table responds to rainfall events. So we started to look at the larger rainfall events or extreme events. We categorize these as greater than 2-inch rainfall events. And on average, this is just an example here for Bodie Island data. On average, the groundwater level rise associated with a rainfall event is about 5 times the depth of the rainfall event. So, for example, in this situation, there was a 7-inch rainfall event. The groundwater level rose approximately 35 inches. And on the right side, showing the scatter plots for all the individual sites, you can see the patterns to exist basically for all of the systems. That with larger rainfall events, we'll get elevated groundwater level rises. So for large precipitation events, the groundwater table can rise pretty dramatically. Here's an example from the Wanchese Community Center where a 7-inch rainfall event led to almost a 4-foot water table rise. And so then when you look at how that groundwater table recedes over time, it can take several months for the groundwater levels to get back to baseline levels. And so here's an example here of the groundwater rise following the storm event. Some of those can be pretty substantial, like I mentioned, up to 4 feet at this site. And it can take several months for those groundwater levels to get back to pre-event levels. So that can influence how systems are effective in that area for several months. So these groundwater records at the various
I think our video is frozen for a moment. Hopefully it's coming right back. Well, I do see a question in the chat at the moment that maybe we could answer while the video tries to come back. Yeah, and I can also increase the volume as well. So Kenneth Ori asked, what antecedent conditions do you take into account for the groundwater table to rainfall? Is that something you could answer, Mike?
Yeah, we are getting into that right now. Just looking at, there's not as much soil moisture data. So Jared Bowden, he's been looking into that, getting some soil moisture data. But generally speaking, we were just looking at the groundwater versus rainfall information there.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Mike, I'm not sure what's going on with this, so I'm going to suggest you ad lib until I can get it to start playing again.
Sure. Yeah. Do you want to go back a couple of slides and I can just finish up
Yeah.
the main points?
Is that good?
Yeah. So basically, for this data, looking at all the groundwater records for the particular wells, we looked at the time periods, the duration when the water table was less than 3.5 feet. So that would generally be the time frame based on the 1.5 foot separation distance, where the groundwater table is rising up and you're not getting as effective treatment based on the rules. So those are in the blue bar graphs there. And then the orange is looking at the time frame when the water table is less than 2 feet. And so if the drain lines are buried at 2 feet, this is going to be a time frame when the systems aren't working at all. If you have systems in that area, basically the groundwater is flooding the drain line. So the examples at the end there are just showing some frequency duration curves for a good site, which would be at Manio Airport, where they have a very deep water table, and then the Spencer Creek site, where it's frequently flooded, and so it wouldn't be very suitable. Yeah, so next slide, please.
Okay, we've got a couple questions in the meantime, Mike, and I think I figured out maybe what happened here. Just real quick, A.R. Rubin asked, did any of the sites have artificial drainage in the community?
Yeah, that's something we're going to look into next, because it's very well linked, and there is some artificial drainage in certain areas in the region for sure. So this was just looking to try to put our work in a context first on what are the longer term patterns with the groundwater systems. But definitely in the future, we'll look at some of the artificial drainage that's going on.
And then John Mullis asks, I'm curious if the seasonality of the hospitality industry and the influx of people is enough to move the needle during the warm months.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I didn't talk about it, but we have some new wells that are set up as part of this. And some of those wells are at restroom facilities at the beach where we could see that seasonality for sure. There's one at the Nags Head Complex, and one at Coastal Studies Institute, and then a few more in the area. But one of the ideas was one of the restrooms was closed up for the summer, for the winter, sorry. So we could compare that to another one that had inputs during the off season too. So we should be able to see that. It's going to be a different world now. Right now we have things that are logging, but nobody's using the restrooms, or it's not as much usage as you would expect. So we'll take a look at that later. Yeah.
Okay, let me see if I can get this video to go. One moment. Back to, I think we were
15, I think.
15.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, why don't you just go on, Mike, and continue? Am I at the right place?
The one slide back, yeah. See, if it doesn't play, then I can just go through that.
There you go. Yeah, I'll let you go.
Okay, so the recent work down in Miami, where they really saw a pretty broad impact related to sea level rise, and they started to kind of lump their systems into functioning systems and those systems that may be considered compromised if the water table rises up into the area that they'd like to have for their separation distance, or if the water table rises enough that it's actually drowning out the drain field. And so based on our separation distances for sandy soils like we would have out there in North Carolina of 1.5 feet, what the data suggests is basically, if you look broadly at the Dare County data, the groundwater levels have risen about a foot since the 1980s, since they started monitoring. And so some systems that would have been considered functional and having adequate separation distance now may be compromised or even considered failing based on these changes. So next slide, please.
So the reason this is significant, this change in groundwater depth, is because there's a direct relationship between the groundwater depth and the treatment of the waste in the subsurface. Nutrient and bacteria removal are associated with the separation distance to the water table. So the thicker the separation distance is, the deeper the water table, the better treatment in general. And this is just a couple of other research papers that have shown some of these patterns. Jennifer Cooper and their group at University of Rhode Island had a recent paper looking at climate change influence on on-site systems. And then Charlie Humphrey and Guy and myself, we worked on some systems, this particular system here, where it showed that treatment efficiency for nutrients, for nitrogen in particular, declined as the water table rose. And there's similar results have been shown in the literature for removal of bacteria. The other factor that becomes important with sea level rise too is the distance between the drain field and the surface water body. This is called the setback distance. And so as sea level rises and the surface water encroaches on the land, the setback distance starts to shrink. And the greater setback distance you have, the greater treatment you generally have. So if you lose setback distance to the surface water body, there will generally be a decline in contaminant attenuation. And this is just an example, one of the studies we did monitoring the plume discharging from a drain field adjacent to the Pamlico River estuary for total dissolved nitrogen in this case. And Jared Bowden at NC State has been researching different climate scenarios and how they can influence the functionality of our on-site system. So we're looking forward to seeing how this research goes, but he's looking at sea level rise, changes in precipitation extremes, and then also antecedent soil moisture conditions. So looking at how these potential future scenarios would impact on-site systems. So we'll hopefully be able to present at the next WRRI next year in person. So overall summary here, just finishing up, sea level is rising along North Carolina's coast, and so is the groundwater in the superficial aquifer system. Coastal storms and storm surges that occur can cause elevated water tables that can last for some time, and those can impact the on-site systems and their effectiveness based on changes to the groundwater depth and also the setback distance. The long-term groundwater level rise in coastal communities poses a threat to the functionality of our on-site wastewater systems. And so we may need to consider in the future increasing our separation distance requirements in coastal settings as the groundwater table is rising to protect these systems and guarantee that they'll function into the future. Future work should also look at alternative systems. So part of this grant project, we're looking at the effectiveness of different types of systems in shallow water table conditions. There are siting challenges in areas such as the Outer Banks where there's limited availability of sites with a deep groundwater table. And so there will be limited places where conventional on-site systems may function. Long-term site data is very limited, but it's needed in order to evaluate how climate change can affect these septic systems and their performance and the adjacent coastal water quality. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today online. I know this is a little bit different for a conference session, but we're really thankful that WRRI supported this and let us do this, and really interested in getting feedback and questions online after. So thank you very much, and I appreciate it. Take care. Bye.
Okay, great. So little technical difficulties there, but not too bad. We do have a couple more questions for Mike as we get going. And just before I get to those, I am going to let you, Eric Edwards, share your screen. You should be able to share, I think, at the bottom. I made you a co-host. So see if you can get that set up and let me know if you have any questions about that as you're going along. So let's see, Lorna had a question, Lorna Withrow. Were the distances between subsurface systems in the area of the DEQ wells recorded? And if so, was there an identifiable impact of system proximity? That's to Mike.
Hi, Lorna. Yeah, that's kind of one of our next steps is we're looking generally in Nags Head area and then Folly Beach, South Carolina, and then we have a few other systems that we're actively monitoring. So tying in general, those wells that were available earlier are all within a mile of the coast. And some of them have a much higher density of systems near them than others. So that's part of the next step. And hopefully in the fall, we'll have some of that information compiled to look at numbers of systems that are in areas with more risky groundwater conditions, basically, yeah.
Okay, great. And I think our other question was already answered, so we're good to go on that. It looks like Eric is set up and ready to go. I don't see any other questions in the chat for now. But again, if you have questions for any of the speakers as we go along, something that comes up, even if it's a previous speaker, just make it clear who the question is to, and we'll make sure to ask that between presentations. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Eric Edwards now. He's with NC State University at the Department of Ag and Resource Economics. Go for it, Eric.
All right, great. Well, let me know, Jane, if you can't see or hear me here.
Looks good on my end. I hear you well.
All right, perfect. So, yeah, so this talk is going to build a little bit off of what Mike has just said, and I didn't know exactly all the things he was going to talk about, so I've changed a little bit of my presentation on the fly. But today I have two goals for my talk, and that's I want to provide a little background on the economic aspects of the project that I'm working on with Mike and Jane and others, wastewater infrastructure tipping points, climate adaptation for decentralized systems. And then I want to provide a little bit, almost a tutorial or a perspective on how economists are going to think about managing a pollution problem like septic. So I think what's interesting about this topic from my perspective, I mean, other than I didn't know anything about it coming in, which I think is true of most people, is that how prevalent it is. So when we think about water pollution and Clean Water Act and things like that, we're always thinking about these municipal wastewater plants and point sources. But the EPA estimates that 60 million households in the US rely on on-site septic or small community cluster systems. And as Mike mentioned, there's about 2 million of these systems in North Carolina, and that means that about 50% of North Carolina residents use one of these systems. So if you want to choose a site or a state to think about this issue, North Carolina might actually be the best one. And so while there's some research on how the systems work and how they affect water quality and such, I haven't been able to find anything on the economics of these systems. So beyond that, we don't even know exactly how these systems work, what the economics of them are, how to regulate them, what their effect is. But then, as Mike has discussed extensively, there's going to be a lot of changes. There already have been a lot of changes coming, and so thinking about how to think about the economics of those is also important. So here is one problem, and this is the most like visually stunning thing, I think, for me, and I've presented this to economists and everyone is just shocked by this. And this is these pictures of where septic systems are being placed along the coast, and in particular, what happens after storms. So you can see these boxes are where the waste goes first, and then they go out into the drain fields. And on the left, you see a condemned house in Nag's Head with the septic tank just sitting out there behind. And then on the right, you see Folly Beach, South Carolina, where we have an exposed septic tank. And that one was as a result of, I believe, Hurricane Irene in 2011. And so both these towns have faced the challenge of having extensive or almost complete reliance on septic for wastewater disposal. And then on these shifting, storm-prone and shallow or low, close to the water table locations. And so a lot of times after big storms, big storm events, you see these septic tanks sitting out and exposed. And obviously, as Mike talked about, the closer the water table, whether that's seawater or the groundwater table underneath, gets to the drain field, the less functional these systems are. So one question as an economist I might ask is, why can't you just solve this problem by putting in a sewer system? And I actually have some experience with this because I would visit multiple times a year my aunt in Los Osos, California, which was on the beach. And in the 70s and 80s, small development utilized septic systems. And in 1983, they started testing, finding high nitrate levels in the drinking water. And so you think 1983, they've, development is small, could just put in a sewer. Well, it turns out no. So 27 years later, in 2010, they finally get a sewer project approved, and construction begins. And that entails taking out every road and every front yard in the entire town, and is extremely costly. So as an economist, when we think about what to do, we're going to think about both how to solve pollution problems, but also the potential cost, right? Added on top of that is these sort of challenges of the heterogeneity of these systems. And so this map is just intended to illustrate a bit the heterogeneity of, even within North Carolina, broadly of the types of soil conditions and elevations that these septic systems are going to be placed at, right? And so we can think about on this broad scale, we already have considerable differences, right? What you're doing to regulate septic or to control pollution from septic near the coast is going to be different than what you're doing further away. And then, as Mike has I think alluded to, or maybe made explicit, what also matters is what's going on much more on the ground, right? What's going on in the immediate vicinity, even in, the water flow and water table right around the system where you're putting it in. So in light of these challenges, our grant is, which Mike has talked about, is seeking to kind of look at 4 areas. Right? One is to assess the relative effectiveness of on-site technologies under various climate conditions, right? So this is sea level rise, water table rises, extreme events. What's going to happen when things change to how these systems work? And this is sort of assuming this static idea of we put in a system, it's expected to work, but if conditions change, how is that going to change the performance, and what factors does it based on? But beyond that, I think, and what I think is really cool about this project is we need to think not just in terms of the current regulatory structure and the current setup of how septic is regulated, but to think in terms of how are we going to make it more effective, and how are we going to adapt our systems, and how are we going to change our approach if conditions change to make what we currently have less effective, right? And this is really the realm, in part, of environmental economics, right? How do we achieve low-cost, effective pollution abatement? And so that's what I'm going to spend a good part of the end of my talk talking about. And then our goal with the project is, of course, to build this framework and these ideas into something that planners and officials can use all along the coast here in thinking about how to deal with the challenges. So I've broken the economic questions into 2 sort of categories. The first I would label under things I'm really interested in and we hope to do something with, but are going to be very difficult. This is the area of the literature that you kind of would expect to have been done, and I don't think it's really fully been explored. And that is, what is the cost of utilizing septic on human health? And even just using the widespread use of septic systems in North Carolina, how costly is that? Is it costly? And how costly is that in terms of human health? And then beyond that, what happens when septic systems aren't properly maintained or regulations aren't followed? So in other words, the first step would be, given the regulations we have, how well are we doing? Then what happens when we don't follow the regulations? And then what's going to happen under the changing climate, right? These are very broad, large questions. For the rest of the talk, I'm going to focus on 4, 5, and 6, which is how might an economist think about improving outcomes of the utilization of septic, right? How do you choose a cost-effective approach to regulating septic? how do you balance the control of different pollutants, and how does climate change affect 4 and 5? As I get into that, I want to lay out 2 key economic concepts. The first is the idea of a marginal cost or benefit. That's going to be the cost or benefit of 1 additional unit. So when we're thinking about coastal septic, we're considering maybe new regulations. So we're worried that there's going to be a problem going forward with sea level rise and things. So we're thinking about requiring more robust systems to go in. And so just a complete hypothetical, we could require a system that is going to say abate 90% of the pollution, or one that's going to abate 75% of the pollution. And as an economist, the way we think about this on the margin is that you're spending $10,000 to get that extra 15 percentage point abatement, right? So it's not always the case, right, that you want to spend the most and put in the most stringent pollution control measure if you're considering cost, right? Why that's important comes to our next concept, and that's the opportunity cost. Because if you save money, maybe being less stringent, where that extra stringency is very costly on the margin, you can put that money that you've saved into something else, right? So the example for that is you could put $30,000 into System X, which works really well, but you could also spend $15,000 for System Y, right? So you spend less and you do a less good job of cleaning up pollution in one area, but you save that extra money to clean up pollution in another area. And especially as towns and cities are considering what to do in the face of climate change, we're going to be faced with big challenges coupled with constrained budgets, right? So we're going to have to figure out how to spend the money cost effectively. And that's a big part of the economics of this project. So now a little economics graph for those of you who have had bad experiences with introductory microeconomics. I apologize. I just want to start out thinking about a town that has a budget, and they have 2 potential cleanup activities, activity A and activity B, right? Activity A, the cost of cleaning it up, the marginal cost is higher, right? So from left to right on the x-axis, we see pollution reduction, right? And then the cost of each unit of reduction on the y-axis. So A is an expensive thing to do, B is a low cost thing to do. So what the city is first going to do is they're going to look at their total budget, which is the price times the quantity, and they're going to allocate that budget equally across their 2 projects. When they do that, right, they allocate that budget equally, they abate less in pollution reduction on QA because it's more expensive, and more pollution reduction on QB because it's cheaper. But in total, they're going to arrive at Q total way out there, right? So in total, they get the same amount of pollution reduction, right? Alternatively, right, they could have lower pollution from A, lower abatement from A, allow more pollution from A, and abate more from B. That's the same pollution reduction, and but at a lower cost, because the marginal cost of abatement is equalized at P. And so the takeaway from this graph is that to find an efficient level of pollution reduction, we need to equalize the marginal cost of abatement, not equalize the budgets going to different things, right? So it may be that your new technologies you're putting in, you don't want the biggest and the best. You want to spend a little less on that and take that savings to retrofit some old technologies or something like that. The second area I want to think about is how we think about pollution reduction in terms of multiple pollutants, right? So you could install a technology that abated one type of pollutant more and another less, or a different technology that reduced both the same. And so what I have here is a production possibilities frontier. This is basically that line, that blue line is going to be the limit of what you can do, right, at your current budget. So D and A are both on the frontier, which means that we can reduce more of pollutant A and less of pollutant B at D, or we can reduce more of B and a little less of D at A. But there's no way to do both, keep one at least as well, at least as much abatement, and also abate the other. However, if we were at B, right, we're sort of at this suboptimal point where we could change our mix of technologies and move to A, keeping abatement of B the same and increasing abatement of A, right? So what I really want to think about here is, well, what's going to happen as some factor changes? Here I've put sea level as the factor that's changing, right? Sea level rise. I'll talk on the next slide about why, and Mike talked about this as well, why sea level rise might not be as important as water table rise, freshwater rise. But here's a change in climate, right? Because of the change in climate, we've gotten less effective at being able to reduce pollutants, right? Sea levels rise and a lot of our systems become impaired. And so it's going to be more expensive to even get the same level of pollution abatement. But it's also shifted our production possibilities frontier, right? And it may have even shifted our ability to to think about the trade-off between pollutant A and pollutant B, right? So now C is on the frontier. We know if we were at E that we could improve our mix of technologies to move to C, right? But the trade-off is not necessarily going to be the same as it would have been under the current sea level. And so the decision we make, right, under a future climate conditions might be very different than the decision we're making previously. And so it's really important to keep in mind as we go forward. So what are the takeaways so far? On the right here, I have this real basic diagram of what a septic system might look like with its leaching field. And so my first takeaway has been that septic is regulated via what we would call minimum technology standards. There's a code given some set of conditions. A person goes in, gets a permit, they have to abide by a certain technology. North Carolina actually has a list of approved technologies that you can use for septic. And they go in. Those standards can change over time, but this is going to suggest some real potential inefficiencies in terms of the cost effectiveness of this regulation, right? One, old technology is going to probably be less effective. So older septic systems are going to be less effective than new ones. And so the money we're putting into new systems is going to suggest that marginal cost of abatement isn't equalized with the old systems. The second takeaway is that site characteristics are critical to understanding system performance. This is going to add to potential inefficiencies in our regulatory approach, but also potential difficulties in figuring out how to solve it, right? So one way to think about this is not only are you going to have a variety of different systems performing differently, and you have to think across those systems how to effectively cut things back, but you're also going to have to think about the local conditions, right? Is the flow of water going somewhere where it's contaminating? Is the soil condition such that the leaching field is effective or not effective, et cetera? Add to all this the problem that cost and performance are not well understood. And what I mean by this is that we know that these systems, how these systems are supposed to work, and our colleagues like Mike on the project are evaluating under the actual on the ground conditions, how well they're working. But what we don't have well documented is the relationship between abatement of pollution, how effective these systems are, and the cost, right? Should we be putting in $50,000 systems, $100,000 systems on every house on the beach? Should we just be putting in the cheap systems and making people pay some sort of tax or fee to go back and retrofit their neighbors' systems? We just don't know. And then in the face of all that, we have these changing conditions that both involve, right, sea level rise and water table rise that could make all the relationships that we think we know change. And so determining what margins these systems are changing on is critical. So to address these challenges going forward, we want to establish a baseline understanding of these key margins, which determine performance and cost. We want to understand how current regulation interacts with these factors to incentivize cost-effective or non-cost-effective control technologies. And then given both the performance and the interaction with regulation, how adding this third factor, which is the changing climate, changing water tables, changing sea levels, are going to interact. So that concludes the talk. See if I can take some questions, if I can find my chat box here.
All right, thanks, Eric. There haven't been any questions yet in the chat for Eric, but please do add them if you have them. At this time, I'm actually going to switch up our order. Larry, I'd like you to go next. I've given you co-host abilities, so you should be able to share your screen. Lindsay, I am having trouble bringing up your video, and it's on my end. For some reason, it doesn't want to show it at all. I was having some issues with this the other day, but then I fixed it, thought it was okay. So I'm thinking that after Larry, Lindsay, if you can share your screen and share your video, that might be the only way that I can figure this out. But I'm going to continue playing around with it. And I'll also send the video to Anna and see if she can open it on her screen. So anyway, let's go to Larry next. And again, if you have questions for Eric or anyone as we go along, you can add those.
Okay. All right. Can everyone hear me and see me?
Yes, looking good, Larry.
Okay, good. Well, thank you. And I think aside from whatever technical glitch might have delayed putting Lindsay's presentation up, I think that Mike and Eric's presentations kind of led very nicely into the one I'm about to give. The background image here is a sanitary system overflow. All of that gooey grayish brown stuff is sewage coming out of a collection main in Wallace Park. This is a city park in downtown Wilmington after Hurricane Florence came through. And what I want to talk about is central wastewater treatment systems. What led me into this was the fact that back in the 90s and 2000s, city Wilmington and New Hanover County, which are the most urbanized regions of the North Carolina coast, became the poster child for sanitary system overflows or sewage spills. And that has to a great degree been remedied by a variety of fairly expensive repairs and maintenance efforts. But I managed to get into a series of fights with some of the local managers over this, and I decided to take a hard look at what was causing the problem. And I was led very rapidly to the idea that sanitary system overflows, when central wastewater systems fail to contain the sewage and deliver it where it should go, this is largely a function of what we call I&I. Which is inflow and infiltration. A couple of problems here. Both central and on-site wastewater treatment systems are below ground and out of sight. Very few people pay a whole lot of attention to them but they are extremely important forms of infrastructure for reasons you've already heard about. Inflow and infiltration are one of the major problems that you have with central wastewater treatment systems. It mirrors a lot of what you've already heard about with regard to on-site wastewater treatment systems. Extraneous water getting into the system from below or above and causing that system to perform poorly or to fail outright. In the case of central wastewater treatment systems, the failures can take two forms. One is that the system itself leaks, it overflows, it can't hold the volume that's coming through. The other is that treatment efficiency at the plant degrades with higher flow. All wastewater treatment plants are rated in terms of their maximum treatment capacity. And if you exceed that, treatment quality goes down and you wind up with trouble on the back end. Obviously, when you have sanitary system overflows, you've got a set of problems in the form of damage to water quality. It may be fleeting, but it may be more persistent than you realize. And of course, a risk to human health. The very first slide I showed you shows the problem with sanitary system overflows in a public park. Kids and such want to play there and they don't realize that the brown water is probably bad for them. So I took a big data look at the effects of rainfall, temperature, and sea level on flows through central wastewater treatment systems in the coastal counties of North Carolina. I looked at 2 years worth of data that I was able to get from NCDEQ with regard to daily flows through these wastewater treatment systems. They're required to monitor that. I also got temperature and rainfall data from the most proximal national weather stations, and took a look at all three factors together in multiple regression models. And what I'm going to do is walk you through the individual effects and highlight what they're all about. With regard to sea level, 2 years doesn't give you a long-term sea level change, but on a daily basis, what it does give you is seasonal stuff, as well as the lunar tide cycle, neap and spring tides. And sea level has an effect on groundwater level, as you're aware. Let me back up just 1 second and explain the difference between inflow and infiltration and why groundwater matters.
Just real quick, Larry, there's no
Sure.
way to make it bigger, right? I know comment, and I think you and I played around with it last week, and
oh, that didn't work. Make it bigger. I don't think so.
Right now you've got it in that notes view, and when you press it on the screen view, nothing, I don't think that was working for us last week in practice.
Okay. Yeah, I don't.
We can see it well enough. It's just a little small.
Can you? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'll do my best to walk you through it because I'm right up against the screen, and I have trouble seeing it. But I'll explain the legend here for the figures. Inflow is water entering a central wastewater treatment collection system from above, typically through leaking manhole covers. So if your manholes are underwater, you're going to get water flowing into the system. That's inflow. There are a few other forms of inflow, but that's the main one. Infiltration is water entering the collection system underground, typically through leaks, cracks, and such in the piping system itself. Bear in mind, you never see those pipes after they've been installed. People who install them know that. Quite often, they cut corners. That was certainly the case here in New Hanover County. In some cases, the materials used and the engineering used were substandard. The Wilmington city collection system dates back about a century. And so the materials used were clearly not as good as the ones now. In any event, when we look at sea level, the larger the black circle here, the larger the effect of sea level. And what we have is the northeastern part of the coastal region, the central part, and the southeastern part. Wilmington's up in here. Notice that some of the biggest circles are more or less inland from the coast. You don't get as much tidal excursion there, but you get some, and you also get wind tides and that sort of thing, and they show up in the gauging data. These systems, Elizabeth City, Hertford, that's Manteo, Bellhaven, Aurora, these are not wealthy towns. Their sewer systems tend to be rather old. And so the interpretation I come out of that is that these are systems that probably aren't all that watertight anymore. And so sea level rise is causing increased flows of water through them. An interesting anecdote, Carolina Beach. When I spoke with the operator for the wastewater treatment plant there, he told me that on high tides, he could measure salinity in the incoming sewage water. It was not zero. He was getting salt water coming through the system. Salt water is bad for wastewater treatment plants for a couple reasons. Number one, at some level of salinity, it can affect the microbial treatment process itself. I'd be curious as to how that works for on-site systems. As an aside, the other thing is that salt water can be corrosive to metal parts. And a third thing is that the sulfate in seawater under anaerobic conditions, which will happen in a sewer system, can be reduced to sulfide. And sulfide can react with the calcium in cement, things like your manhole structures and other concrete structures, and actually degrade them fairly rapidly.
Larry,
So,
real quick, I've gotten one
yep.
comment about how we might be able to fix the display settings. Do you see top left? That is the
Top
display
left,
settings.
show taskbar.
Just to the right of that.
Display settings, yes.
Try that.
Oh, yes.
Wow.
I
Thank you.
love that. Okay.
There you go.
All right. Whew. I'm relatively new to Zoom. In any event, now I've learned something. Thank you very much. Okay, sea level. We also looked at temperature, and I noted a comment or a question earlier in Mike's talk by someone on the chat box about temperature effects, and obviously temperature is higher in the summer and lower in the winter. And the question was asked, does that incorporate the seasonality of tourism? And yes, it does. The boxes here on the right, the legend here, I want you to notice the temperature effects largely are negative. In other words, there's less flow through the wastewater treatment systems when the temperature is warmer. By and large, I think that represents an evapotranspiration effect in the summer. And I think Mike touched on that as well. There is, however, some evidence of a tourism effect. The largest circle here represents a positive effect of temperature on wastewater treatment flows. And I think that represents seasonal tourism, certainly for Carolina Beach, Southport, Manteo, I would guess Columbia, Hartford, I have no idea, but I would imagine it's the same thing. So we have two conflicting effects of temperature on I&I for these wastewater treatment systems. The big one, though, is rainfall. And I think Mike did a wonderful job of showing how much groundwater level rises for a given amount of rainfall. There's not a whole lot of interstitial space in the ground, of course, and so a couple inches of rain produces a dramatic rise in groundwater levels. And what you see over here in the legend, these are all positive effects. As rainfall levels go up, the amount of flow coming through the wastewater treatment system gets big, and that reflects infiltration. By and large, well, I've broken out both inflow and infiltration separately. The big effect is infiltration. I would argue that the premier effect of climate change here in North Carolina, one that we're already seeing, is rainfall effects. Matter of fact, if we step back and get away from the the strict coastal systems and look at systems throughout the coastal plain region, this is about 92 of them. The rainfall effects, again, here the key is less than 10%, which is kind of a nominally acceptable amount of I&I, and over 30% increase in flow for a rain event, an average rain event, that is. And what you can see is lots of big circles here. A lot of these systems are affected very substantially by big rain events. A lot of these more rural places, and I've had to number some of them. I've named only the ones that have fairly big effects: Ahoskie, Lewiston, Woodville, Robersonville, Trenton. Oops, sorry about that. There we go. Curie Beach. By and large, these are small systems. They're not heavily capitalized. Expanding a sewer system is expensive, and the rainfall effects are quite significant. When it rains hard, they have trouble handling the sewer inflow. They're more likely to have SSOs. They're more likely to have treatment problems. The climate effect that I mentioned a slide ago, unfortunately, is an exponent. As temperatures go up, the solubility of water vapor goes up exponentially, and what goes up must come down. Water vapor, unlike the greenhouse gases, is not infinitely soluble in the air. The factors that make it rain, convection, cooling, and so forth, still operate. Temperature doesn't really change those. And so what we're going to get is rather more extreme rain events, which of course we've been seeing. Not just here in North Carolina, but when you look around the whole world, we're seeing more extreme rain events, and not just hurricanes, but other kinds of systems as well tend to be dumping more rain. So where are we headed? We're going to have heavier rains. That's going to cause more trouble with sanitary system overflows. We're going to have more and nastier hurricanes. I saw just a few days ago that North Carolina State's Leon Jay and his team are predicting we're going to have 18 to 22 hurricanes or named storms in the North Atlantic this year. I'm so looking forward to that. Sea level is rising. It's rising rather more rapidly in the northeastern part of the state than it is here in the southeastern part, but it's rising and it's accelerating. So we're going to get more SSOs with these central wastewater treatment systems. Eric touched on the costs of these systems. There has been a tendency, especially in the beach communities, to go from septic systems, which perform poorly as sea level goes up and with very sandy soils and storm events and that sort of thing, to go over to central wastewater treatment systems. Those are all hideously expensive. One of the premier objections to them by the ratepayers is how much they cost. Putting pipe in the ground is expensive. The ballpark figure is about $1 million a mile to install underground pipe. And if you're going to maintain or replace an older system, the cost is about that much as well. So this is a very significant expense. I would argue that we have an economic analysis issue, and I'm glad that Eric touched on that so well. We have choices. I'll get into that as well in a bit. I had a conversation about 2 months ago, before we were not allowed to travel, with an outfit that was based in Long Island in New York. And they have been looking at exactly this I&I problem for their town wastewater treatment system scattered around the beaches of Long Island. And they were trying to solve that problem, and they had gone in and done the work on the publicly owned parts of those systems. That's the collection mains and force mains, the pump stations and so forth. But the sewer laterals, the pipes that connect your home or business to the collection mains, are privately owned. And I inserted the word maintained and struck through it, because guess what? How many homeowners actually maintain their sewer laterals? Probably approaching zero, unless you're forced to do it. How would you even know you had a problem? Only if your own sewer system backed up and that sort of thing. That's pretty rare. Would you know if it was leaking? Would you know if your own sewer lateral was contributing to overall infiltration in the collection system itself? Probably not. Anyway, that company had contracts from the towns to go in and actually repair and replace those privately owned sewer laterals. And they were finding they accounted for about 50% of the total I&I, which is significant. And that's a very big problem in terms of regulation and economics. The final thing I want to say is that I want to make a pitch here for taking a hard look at alternative waste treatment technology. I think that central systems, as I've said more than once, are hideously expensive. You know, we've come up with ways to heat our homes, to treat our well water if it's hard, that are on-site kinds of systems. Septic tanks, no matter how you cut it, are 1800s technology, if you even want to call it that. I'm convinced that we can do a better job than that. There are other situations where compact wastewater treatment devices have been developed on ships, for example, and other places where you've got other constraints. The technology is there. Developing that technology for more common use by the residential public might be worth a great deal of investment, because sea level rise and higher rainfall are going to drive our septic systems and our wastewater treatment systems into serious trouble as time goes on. So let me stop there and see if we have questions.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Larry. I'm going to mention a few things that came up in the chat, but while I do that, I'm also going to let Anna actually share her screen. She's going to be able to show the final presentation video. So I think hopefully that'll work out. The two items I saw in the chat, one was from Jay McLeod, and that was actually earlier to Eric. And he was saying that it sounds like we need to develop county-wide GIS data sets for septic system installation dates and correlate with water table depth. I think that's a great idea.
Yep.
And then I saw there's a comment during your presentation, Larry, John Mullis. He says, as a former town manager, elected officials just will not raise rates. They reluctantly do so when there is a catastrophic failure. Maintaining infrastructure is going to be a major problem.
Absolutely. I've had conversations in a variety of contexts about that, and the folks who manage wastewater treatment systems freely share that they need this and that upgrade, and they need work done, engineering and so forth. And the answer they get back all the time is, if we go to the public, the ratepayers, with what you're asking for, we'll get killed. They don't want to pay for it. And that's why I think we really need to take a hard look at alternative technologies that are affordable and effective, especially in the coastal environment where water tables are killing us.
Great. Thank you so much, Larry. Again, as folks are listening to the final presentation, do ask your questions in the chat or comments. I'm going to let Anna get this final presentation going.
Good morning, everyone. Can you all see my screen? Jane, are we good? All right. I tested this a minute ago. I think we're going to be good to go, but I'll go ahead and get it playing for you all.
Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Galvin, and I am a rising senior at UNC Chapel Hill, and I studied at the Outer Banks field site in the fall semester of 2019, along with all the students who are going to be presenting today. Hi, my name is Claire Bradley, and I'm a sophomore.
Hi, everyone. My name is Avery Murray, and I'm a graduating senior.
Hi, my name is Anna Gray Anderson, and I'm a junior. So our study is about people, water, and septic. In coastal areas, altered hydrological patterns, such as large storms and increasing flooding, is threatening to local infrastructure, especially septic systems, which most coastal areas rely on to manage their waste. Our research was conducted in Nags Head, North Carolina, which is located on a chain of barrier islands in northeastern North Carolina called the Outer Banks. So wastewater generated in homes and businesses in Nags Head is largely treated in on-site septic systems, as is true in most small coastal communities. If you look at the diagram on your right, it explains how a septic system is designed to work. So when a septic system works properly, wastewater flows from your house out into the septic tank itself and drain fields that are typically located in yard areas close to the home. As the wastewater flows into the septic tank, solids settle and liquids pass through to the drain fields, where the wastewater is slowly dispersed into the soil. And as this soils of the drain field, the wastewater is properly treated as the natural processes in the soil break down and clean the wastewater. So septic systems rely heavily on enough soil for water to pass through to be treated. And changes to the social hydrological cycles, such as climate change, and increases in impermeable surfaces can affect the efficacy of septic wastewater treatment. For instance, separation distance of the unsaturated soil between the fields and the water table. So Nags Head is actually taking many proactive steps to address the water quality problems associated with underfunctioning septic systems, including the Todd D. Kraft Septic Health Initiative, which helps maintain proper care of the systems. And then also the Groundwater lowering project, which is exactly as it sounds. So groundwater can be lowered through pumping or draining the groundwater into a different water reservoir, which helps with that distance of unsaturated soil in the drain fields. So you can see where the water table is in this diagram and that separation of soil and the drain field. So in our research project, we mainly studied water level and susceptibility analysis in Nags Head, and we also had a human dimensions analysis to see the public's perception of risk concerning septic tanks. We also looked at water quality in the area, but focused mainly on the two topics just mentioned. So now I'll hand it off to Avery, who will talk more about our findings for the water level and susceptibility analysis part of our research.
All right, thanks, Anna Gray. For our first research question, we wanted to find areas in our study site, the Gallery Row subwatershed, that are susceptible to interactions between groundwater and wastewater using geospatial analysis. For those unfamiliar with the area, the Gallery Row subwatershed is located in Nags Head, a town on the Outer Banks. The Outer Banks is a chain of barrier islands on the east coast of North Carolina. Nags Head is located to the northeast of Roanoke Island. So the first step in our geospatial analysis process was to collect depth to groundwater measurements from 5 monitoring wells located across the subwatershed, pictured in this map, in order to create a cross-section of our study area. We collected this data on 7 days over our study period from September 21st to October 29th of 2019. We then found the land surface elevation data for the subwatershed online from USGS. The next step was to determine the water table elevation from our depth to groundwater and land surface elevation data by subtracting the depth to groundwater from the land surface elevation, as shown in this graphic. The final step was to use GIS to create a digital elevation model. The digital elevation model visualizes the land as a 3D surface and compares where the water table elevation is in relation to the ground surface across the subwatershed. This map shows the results of our geospatial analysis. According to the analysis, approximately half of the subwatershed area has an insufficient separation between the water table and the ground surface for proper septic system function. Through our research, we determined that 3 feet of separation is necessary for proper septic system function. On the map, blue represents areas of high susceptibility to groundwater-wastewater interactions, orange represents a moderate susceptibility, and green represents a low susceptibility. The most susceptible areas were the low-lying areas along roads where homes and businesses are generally located. Our geospatial analysis has some limitations, however. The first limitation is our short study period, which does not allow us to accurately analyze susceptibility in all seasons. This is important because water use varies heavily in the Outer Banks between seasons. Another limitation is that we did not collect data on septic systems, locations, and states of repair, which would have been helpful in further refining and representing susceptible areas. Now that we've mapped susceptibility, I'll pass it off to Claire, who will discuss the human dimensions aspect of our study.
Thank you, Avery. So like she said, we did a quantitative section of our study, but we also did a qualitative one to look at how do different groups and individuals perceive and understand the risk of surface and groundwater contamination from wastewater in Nags Head, North Carolina. We conducted 18 semi-structured interviews with 4 stakeholder groups, which were public officials, researchers, septic professionals, and property owners. We followed a guide that was made specifically for these different groups to keep the ideas consistent, but the questions pertinent to the differences between the groups. We conducted qualitative analysis of the transcripts that we got from these interviews, and that process allowed us to come out with 4 different themes of what everyone said. Those themes were water as a source of identity, environmental changes, risk perceptions of that contamination, and how to address that risk. So for the first theme, water as a source of identity, interviewees spoke about their experiences with these issues, and we heard how much the area means to them, especially to the property owners. We called this sense of place. One public official said, "I think the waters make Nags Head, and the whole Outer Banks are a place that directly interacts with water." From this quote, we pulled out that the waters are so critical to the area that they're defining. And the next theme, environmental changes, describes why they care so much. So with environmental changes, we are interested in how people observe environmental change because of how those changes can impact how well or poorly septic systems work. Interviewees discussed noticing more flooding due to increased development, more big storms like Hurricane Dorian, and higher water tables. The heart of our research was to address the risk perceptions that people had of the contamination between septic and groundwater and wastewater, or groundwater and surface water. And we found that public officials, researchers, and septic professionals all had a very high perceived risk. On the other hand, we found that property owners had a pretty low risk perception of this kind of contamination based on the answers. And one resident said, "I realized that wastewater directly affects the family and the ocean quality, and that can really affect our lives, and so it's very important." This quote shows us that this resident is perceiving a risk of recreational water contamination instead of the surface and groundwater contamination we talked about and analyzed in this study, and other residents seem to echo this as well. But the goal of figuring out what these risk perceptions are is to find ways to address that risk. And so we got many different suggestions from the interviewees, and one interviewee emphasized the importance of individual action and maintenance of their systems, getting them pumped, etc. However, in many coastal regions where property owners live in their houses for only short amounts of time, this might not always be possible or effective. And so other interviewees discussed how realtors could give out information to people when they're buying a house about how septic systems work, and maybe the government of the city could do a little bit more to inform property owners of how their systems work and how they need to be maintained. But these are tricky and interconnected problems. There's unlikely to be a one-size-fits-all solution, and we're going to need to approach this from many different angles. The implications are that we know things are going to go in the right direction for change to happen if we have a certain behavior change, and that behavior change is impacted by many different things. Having a strong sense of place is really important because people like where they are, they feel protective of it. And so when those environmental changes occur, they want to try to stop them so that their place can remain how it was before. But the third thing that's impacting behavior is knowledge of that relevant information. And hopefully, if the goal is to change that behavior to create less septic interaction, we will focus on that third piece of it, informing people, and that will therefore impact the behavior as well. So now I'm going to pass it off to Emily, who's going to talk about raising awareness to address this last piece, and the podcast we made plays into this.
Thanks, Claire. Like Claire mentioned, understanding risk and improving access to information have been common themes throughout our study. And while the findings of our project can be helpful to municipalities and property owners, we know that it's difficult for the information in this report and presentation to reach a wider audience. So in an effort to address this, we created a podcast. Our podcast is called Flushed, and in its 3 episodes, we try to construct a tool for residents of the Outer Banks to better understand the impacts of a changing socio-hydrological cycle on their septic systems, as well as discuss generally some of the climate and water system issues that these communities will face in the future. Each episode runs slightly under 20 minutes, and they were recorded from the makeshift recording studios we constructed in our residence hall. They offer interview with students as we act as guest experts on different components of our research, as well as excerpts from interviews conducted with residents, researchers, and public officials. In the first episode, Fecal Matters, we paint a picture of what it means to live on a barrier island and discuss hydrology, sense of place, and basic mechanisms of septic systems. In episode 2, Fluent and Effluent, we dive deeper into our own research and what it means for water quality and the public's risk awareness of the threats to septic systems. And finally, in episode 3, The Bottom Line, we talk about solutions, like the town of Nags Head's Todd DeCraft Septic Health Initiative. We encourage you to give the podcast a listen. You can find it on Apple or Spotify podcasts by searching Flushed UNC. And for a final discussion of our findings, answering our first research question, we found that 50% of the study sites were susceptible to groundwater, wastewater, and surface water interactions through an analysis through GIS. Secondly, in the human dimensions component of our research, we found that different stakeholders have different risk perceptions of these threats to septic health. Finally, we also conducted a portion of our research on water quality parameters in Nags Head related to the groundwater lowering. So if you're interested in learning more about our results for this, you can Google OPXFS and you'll find a link to the full written report. At a larger scale, we see that the susceptibility of an area can lead to the presence of undertreated wastewater, which can determine the risk of that area, though risk perceptions may vary. And with that, we would like to thank all those who contributed to this project, our professors, Andy Keeler, Corey Adams, Lindsay Dubs, and Linda Dana, as well as our fellow students listed here on these slides, as well as the support we received from the Coastal Studies Institute, UNC, and our housing accommodations. Finally, we'd like to dedicate this project to Todd DeCraft, who was active in public and septic health for much of his life in the Outer Banks community. Thank you all.
Great. Thanks, Lindsay et al., the Coastal Studies Institute. You'll notice that there are some questions in the chat. I don't think I can answer any or many of them, but if folks who have presented today can answer any of those, please do. Or if you're attending this and you might have an answer, please put that in the chat. I'll just read a few of these out loud. Jim Frey asks, is anyone doing research on sand filter systems? Many are in use in Northwest Wake County and Northeast Durham County. Any published papers on sand filters? Lorna Withrow asks, how do we overcome the prevalence of out of sight, out of mind in regard to wastewater collection, treatment, and disposal systems? I think hearing about that podcast, Flushed, that's kind of an interesting way to try to get the word out. And I asked, how many people are listening to the podcast so far? I'd like to hear how that's going, how it can be promoted, perhaps. I think Sea Grant might be able to promote that. There was also a question from Joe Glass asking about COVID-19 being found in raw wastewater coming into the Columbia, South Carolina WRF. And so basically that there's a belief that conventional treatment processes will kill the virus, although it's not yet been proven. Wanting to know more about this. Larry did say that it's an envelope virus and that they don't survive well out into the environment. It looks like there is an April 2020 issue from the journal Water, Environment, and Technology regarding COVID-19 and what water professionals need to know. Thank you, R. Rubin, for that insight. Just over 280 downloads of the podcast across all 3 episodes. Okay, good to know. I think that's something we could definitely promote in Coastwatch and through the Water Resources Research Institute as well. Okay. Oh, and there's a comment here from Katie Hill about the virus and wastewater. Australia has been testing raw sewage for virus fragments to see which communities have a higher burden. Any other final comments from our presenters today? Okay. Well, I do want to thank our sponsor again. That's YSI, a Xylem brand. Really helpful. They were able to help sponsor the annual conference for WRRI and this session. And thank you all for being with us today. This has been a really experimental thing for us, and I'm glad we were able to get the info out one way or another. Thank you all for your patience, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks.